Brooklyn, New York, October 1917. The blade found flesh before anyone could breathe. 3 inches of cold steel carved through skin and muscle like butter, opening Al Capone's face from ear to jaw in a crimson arc that splattered across the Harvard Inn's grimy floor. The sound was wet and final, a whisper of metal through meat that somehow cut through the din of illegal gambling and desperate laughter. Blood hit sawdust with tiny splashes that would echo through history, each drop carrying the DNA of a future emperor. Al Capone pressed his massive palm against his cheek, feeling his own warmth leak between thick fingers, watching Frank Galluccio step back with satisfaction and crimson decorating his 4-inch blade. The jazz piano never missed a beat. The card games continued. The drunks kept drinking. This was Brooklyn after midnight, where violence was currency and blood was just another bodily fluid that stained the floorboards. But in that crystalline moment, watching his own life essence drip onto decades of accumulated sawdust and cigarette ash, 18-year-old Alphonse Gabriel Capone learned the most important lesson of his brutal life. Words have consequences that last forever, scars tell stories louder than voices, and respect is earned with pain, not given with power. 3 hours earlier, the Harvard Inn buzzed with the electric energy that only illegal liquor and desperate people could create. Prohibition hadn't arrived yet, but everyone knew it was coming, like a slow-moving storm, and the smart money was already flowing through establishments like Frankie Yale's Crooked Kingdom. The air hung thick as molasses, with Cuban cigar smoke and human sweat, punctuated by the sharp crack of ivory pool balls and the soft whisper of marked cards hitting stained felt. Gas lamps cast everything in amber shadows that danced across water-stained walls, decorated with photographs of local prize-fighters and politicians, most of whom owed Frankie Yale money or favors or both. This wasn't some high-society speakeasy with crystal glasses and silk curtains. This was where longshoremen spent their weekly paychecks on watered-down whiskey, where small-time hustlers planned impossible scores over hands of 5-card stud, and where young men with more muscle than sense learned the brutal mathematics of survival and respect. The floorboards creaked under heavy boots, soaked with decades of spilled beer and blood and dreams. Every table told stories of fortunes won and lost, lives changed and ended, alliances forged and betrayals plotted. Al Capone stood near the mahogany bar like a mountain in a cheap suit, his massive frame filling out second-hand clothing that had seen better decades. At 18, he already commanded attention without trying, 6 feet of solid muscle topped with dark eyes that missed nothing and forgot less. His hands were scarred from countless fights, his knuckles permanently swollen from breaking jaws and ribs and spirits. But he was still just hired muscle, a bouncer who threw out drunks and settled disputes with violence instead of words. Frankie Yale had given him the job because young Capone understood the language of fists and boots, but tonight would teach him something infinitely more valuable, the difference between fear and respect, between power and control, between surviving and thriving in Brooklyn's unforgiving underworld. The Harvard Inn catered to Brooklyn's working class, but it also drew a rougher crowd after the midnight church bells finished echoing off tenement walls. Sailors on shore leave with pockets full of foreign coins and hearts full of homesickness. Construction workers flush with weekly wages and calloused hands that knew honest labor, and the occasional wise guy looking to make connections that would elevate them from neighborhood muscle to citywide players. The women who frequented the establishment weren't society daughters with finishing school educations and trust funds. They were working girls who stitched clothes in sweatshops 12 hours a day, wives whose husbands were at sea for months earning dangerous money on merchant ships, and occasionally respectable women who craved something their daylight lives couldn't provide. Lena Galluccio was different from all of them, and everyone who met her understood this immediately. 22 years old, with midnight black hair that caught lamplight like silk, sharp eyes that could read a man's character in 30 seconds, and a reputation for not tolerating disrespect from anyone, regardless of their size or connections. She worked at Romano's textile factory during the day, operating industrial sewing machines that devoured fabric and destroyed fingers. But at night she sometimes came to the Harvard Inn with her closest girlfriends, dancing to the small band that played jazz in the corner and enjoying freedoms that daylight hours and proper society denied her. Her older brother Frank kept a protective eye on her without suffocating her independence, understanding that Lena was smart enough to handle herself, but also knowing that Brooklyn's streets held dangers that intelligence alone couldn't navigate. Frank Galluccio had learned street rules before he could read, carried a knife before he could shave, and understood with bone-deep certainty that in neighborhoods like theirs, family honor was everything. Blood was thicker than water. Respect was more valuable than money, and a man who allowed his sister to be insulted might as well announce that his entire family had no honor worth defending. Frank didn't look for trouble because trouble was expensive and dangerous, but trouble had a way of finding men like him, especially when it involved family and pride and the complex social dynamics that governed Brooklyn's Italian community. Tonight, trouble found him because Al Capone couldn't keep his mouth shut and didn't understand that some words, once spoken, could never be taken back. The trouble started with music and ended with blood, but the middle part was all about words that cut deeper than any blade. Lena Galluccio moved through the crowd with two girlfriends, weaving between small tables where men played cards with deadly seriousness, and couples slow danced to a melancholy jazz number about lost love and broken promises. She wore a midnight blue dress that caught the amber gaslight and moved like liquid around her curves, and more than a few men turned to watch her pass with appreciation and desire, and the kind of careful respect that Brooklyn women demanded. Her laugh cut through the cigarette smoke and cheap cologne, genuine and infectious, the sound of someone enjoying freedom on her own terms. Al Capone noticed her immediately, standing near the bar with a glass of bootleg whiskey in his massive hand, feeling the confidence that came with being the biggest man in any room he entered. Alcohol had loosened his tongue and inflated his sense of importance, making him forget the careful boundaries that governed interactions between men and women in neighborhoods where reputation was everything and family honor was worth dying for. When Lena passed close enough to hear his voice over the jazz piano, Capone leaned forward and delivered a comment about her appearance that wasn't a compliment or a respectful greeting or even a crude proposition. It was something uglier, something that questioned her character and suggested what he'd like to do with her in graphic terms that no respectable woman should ever hear, especially not in public where her reputation could be damaged and her family's honor called into question. The words hit the smoky air like physical objects, cutting through conversation and music and laughter with surgical precision. Lena stopped walking as if she'd hit an invisible wall. Her girlfriends went quiet, their faces showing the shock and embarrassment that came with witnessing something that crossed fundamental lines of decency. The men standing nearby turned to see who had spoken such words, their expressions ranging from surprise to disgust, to the kind of careful neutrality that people adopted when they sensed violence approaching. In that crystalline moment, every person within earshot understood that something had shifted in the Harvard Inn's delicate ecosystem. This wasn't just inappropriate behavior or drunken crudeness. This was disrespect of the highest order, delivered publicly with witnesses, designed to humiliate and degrade. Lena Galluccio looked directly at Al Capone with dark eyes that had turned cold as winter, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment, and delivered a response that made several experienced men wince with its precision and venom. She called him exactly what he was, a crude animal with no respect for women and no understanding of basic decency. Then she continued toward the dance floor with her chin held high and her dignity intact, leaving Al Capone standing at the bar with his reputation suddenly in question and his future hanging by threads he didn't even know existed. Frank Galluccio heard about the insult within minutes, because in the Harvard Inn's tightly woven social fabric, news traveled faster than wildfire and carried more destructive potential than dynamite. Word reached him in the back room where he was playing 5-card stud with 3 longshoremen and a bookmaker, his pile of winnings growing steadily as the night wore on. Tony Morello approached his table with the careful hesitation of a man delivering news that would change everything, leaned down and whispered what had happened to Lena in words that made Frank's blood turn to ice water and his vision narrow to a single point of red-hot focus. The cards stopped moving in his hands. The conversation around the table died like someone had turned off a radio. Everyone present knew what Frank Galluccio would have to do now, because they all understood the unwritten laws that governed Brooklyn's Italian community with more authority than any police badge or court order. A man who allowed his sister to be publicly insulted and degraded might as well hang a sign around his neck announcing that his family had no honor worth defending, no pride worth maintaining, and no respect worth earning. Frank had two choices: respond with violence that would satisfy family honor, or accept that he was weak and watch his reputation crumble like cigarette ash. There was no middle ground, no compromise, no way to negotiate around what had to happen next. Frank Galluccio folded his cards with hands that didn't shake despite the rage building in his chest like steam in a boiler, stood up slowly while calculating the best approach to what needed doing, and checked the bone-handled knife in his jacket pocket that had served him well in previous disputes. The blade was sharp enough to shave with, long enough to reach vital organs, and familiar enough in his grip that using it required no conscious thought. He wasn't looking for a fight, because fights were unpredictable and dangerous and attracted police attention. He was looking to deliver a lesson that would be remembered, respected, and never repeated. The walk from the back room to the main bar took exactly 43 seconds, and in those 43 seconds, Frank Galluccio made a series of decisions that would change Al Capone's life forever and alter the course of American crime history in ways that nobody could predict. He wouldn't just confront the kid who had insulted Lena. He would mark him permanently, creating scars that would serve as a reminder every time Capone looked in a mirror that words have consequences and disrespect carries a price that some men pay with their faces. The confrontation happened near the bar where Al Capone still stood, nursing his drink and probably thinking the incident was over. Frank Galluccio approached from the side, moving with the quiet confidence of a man who had settled disputes with violence before. He didn't announce himself. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stepped into Capone's line of sight and said 6 words that everyone nearby would remember for the rest of their lives. "You owe my sister an apology." The conversation that followed lasted less than 2 minutes, but it covered territory that would define both men's futures. Capone, flush with alcohol and the arrogance that came with being Frankie Yale's muscle, refused to back down. He had made the comment, he stood by it, and he wasn't apologizing to anyone. Frank Galluccio listened to this response with the patience of a man who had already decided how the conversation would end. When Capone finished talking, Frank nodded once, reached into his jacket, and produced a knife with a 4-inch blade. The Harvard Inn didn't go quiet. The music kept playing, people kept drinking, but everyone within 20 feet stopped what they were doing and watched 2 young men decide their futures with steel. The blade moved faster than most people could follow, but for Al Capone, time slowed to a crawl as death approached his face in 3 precise movements. Frank Galluccio struck with the efficiency of a butcher and the artistry of a surgeon, each cut deliberate and calculated to inflict maximum damage without causing death. The first slash opened Capone's left cheek from ear to mouth in a crimson arc that seemed to hang in the air like a painter's brushstroke, parting skin and muscle with a sound like tearing silk. Blood erupted immediately, hot and thick and unstoppable, spraying across Frank's knuckles and spattering onto the sawdust floor where it mixed with decades of accumulated stains from previous violence. The second cut caught Capone's jaw as he stumbled backward in shock and pain, leaving a smaller but deeper wound that would ache every time he chewed food for the rest of his life. The third and final slash traced a line along his neck that missed the carotid artery by less than an inch, close enough that Frank could have opened Capone's throat and painted the Harvard Inn's walls with arterial blood if he had chosen death over lesson teaching. Al Capone stumbled backward against the bar, his massive frame suddenly clumsy and uncoordinated, blood streaming down his face like scarlet tears while his hand instinctively reached for the .38 pistol tucked into his waistband. The Harvard Inn's patrons watched with the detached interest of people who had witnessed violence before and would witness it again, their conversations never pausing, because in neighborhoods like theirs, blood was just another form of punctuation in the endless sentence of survival. But before Capone could draw his weapon, before he could transform a lesson into a war, before the violence could escalate into something that would bring police sirens and newspaper headlines and maybe a chalk outline on the floor, Frankie Yale materialized between the 2 men like smoke given form. Yale had been watching the entire confrontation unfold from his position across the room, understanding immediately that this wasn't just another bar fight between drunks settling imaginary scores. This was a teaching moment wrapped in blood and steel, A lesson about respect that would either make Al Capone smarter or make him dead, depending on how the next few seconds played out. Yale spoke quietly to Frank Galluccio, acknowledging that the insult had required a response, that honor had been satisfied, and that further violence would serve no one's interests. Then he turned to Al Capone, blood still flowing from his wounds, and delivered a piece of wisdom that would shape the young man's entire approach to power. You want respect, you show respect first. You want fear, you earn it with brains, not just muscle. The aftermath unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. Frank Galluccio put away his knife and returned to his card game, the matter settled as far as he was concerned. Lena Galluccio and her friends left the Harvard Inn, her honor defended, and her reputation intact. Al Capone accepted medical attention from the bartender, who had dealt with knife wounds before, and learned that his scars would heal but never fully disappear. Frankie Yale made it clear that there would be no retaliation, no revenge, no escalation. The matter was closed. But for Al Capone, everything had changed. The physical wounds would heal within weeks, but the psychological impact would last forever. He had been humiliated publicly, marked permanently, and taught a lesson about the difference between respect and fear. More importantly, he had witnessed Frankie Yale's approach to conflict resolution, violence when necessary, but always controlled, always purposeful, always in service of larger goals. The scars on his face would earn him a nickname that would follow him to Chicago and beyond. But the real scar was invisible, the one that taught him to think before he spoke, to consider consequences before he acted, and to understand that true power came from controlling situations, not just dominating them. Brooklyn's streets buzzed with news of the Harvard Inn incident. For weeks afterward, the story growing and changing with each telling, until it became something larger than mere violence, something approaching legend. In barbershops where old Italian men argued about baseball and politics, in social clubs where young men planned their futures over glasses of wine, on street corners where bookmakers conducted business and mothers gossiped while children played, people talked about the young bouncer who had been marked by Frank Galluccio's knife and lived to tell about it. Some called it justice served cold and sharp. Others called it excessive violence over mere words. But everyone agreed that Al Capone had learned something fundamentally important about the price of disrespect and the cost of running his mouth without thinking about consequences. The scars healed with agonizing slowness, each day bringing new pain as damaged tissue knitted itself back together in angry red lines that pulled and burned with every facial expression. 3 distinct marks emerged across his left cheek and jaw, raised and permanent reminders that would become his most recognizable feature and eventually his most famous nickname. The deepest cut, running from his earlobe to the corner of his mouth, would never fully disappear no matter how much time passed or how many doctors examined it. Within months, people stopped calling him Alphonse or Al or any of the childhood names that had followed him from Naples to Brooklyn. He became Scarface, a nickname that suggested danger and experience, someone who had been tested by steel and fire and survived to become stronger. The name carried weight in Brooklyn's underworld, opening doors that might have remained closed and commanding respect that muscles alone couldn't earn. But those who knew him best understood that the real change wasn't physical or even social. The cocky, impulsive bouncer who had relied on size and strength to solve every problem had been replaced by someone infinitely more dangerous, a young man who was learning to think before he acted, to calculate before he spoke, and to understand the complex web of relationships and obligations that governed Brooklyn's criminal ecosystem. When Frankie Yale eventually decided to send him west to work for Johnny Torrio in Chicago, Capone carried those bloody lessons with him like precious cargo. The scars on his face told everyone he met that he was dangerous enough to survive knife fights. The invisible scars burned into his mind taught him how to be smart enough to avoid them. Chicago would remember October 1917 as the night a future emperor learned his most important lesson in a Brooklyn bar. The blade that carved through Al Capone's flesh also carved a path toward an empire built on respect rather than just fear, strategy rather than just violence, and understanding rather than just intimidation. Frank Galluccio never knew that his defense of his sister's honor would help create one of America's most notorious crime bosses. Frankie Yale probably suspected that the scarred young man he sent west would amount to something significant, but Al Capone himself understood from that night forward that true power came from knowing when to fight and when to think, when to intimidate and when to negotiate, when to be feared and when to be respected. The Harvard Inn had taught him that brains beat muscle, that respect beat fear, and that the right scar at the right time could transform a street thug into a legend. 3 lines across his cheek became the signature of a man who would rule Chicago, not because he was the strongest, but because he was smart enough to learn from every mistake, including the ones that left permanent marks. The legend was born in blood that night, but it was shaped by the lesson that came after. Every time Al Capone looked in a mirror for the rest of his life, he would see those 3 scars and remember Frank Galluccio's knife, Lena Galluccio's dignity, and Frankie Yale's wisdom. More importantly, he would remember that the most powerful weapon in any man's arsenal wasn't a gun or a blade or a set of brass knuckles. It was the ability to understand that every action had consequences, every word carried weight, and every scar told a story that could either destroy you or make you stronger. Chicago was waiting for someone who understood these lessons. Brooklyn had just finished creating him. If this story about the birth of Scarface left you hungry for more untold legends, smash that like button and hit subscribe, because next week we're diving into the night that changed everything again. Picture this: 14-year-old Al Capone with a smoking gun in his hand, a body at his feet, and a neighborhood that decided to forget what they saw. The story behind Capone's first kill is darker than you think, and the reason nobody reported it will blow your mind. Don't miss it, because once you hear what really happened that night, you'll understand why Chicago never stood a chance.